The sun beat down on the dusty western town, casting long, stark shadows. Wagons groaned under the weight of goods, and horses snorted impatiently at hitching posts. Owen, a rancher known more for his cynical temper than his words, leaned against a post outside the saloon, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. He'd lost his family to a winter fever years ago, and the grief had curdled into a hard, bitter shell. He worked his land alone, his only companions the cattle and the silence. A commotion from the center of town drew his attention. A small, jeering crowd had gathered around the auction platform. Curious, Owen ambled over, pushing through the grinning men. On the stage stood a young Chinese woman, her hands bound. Her clothes were torn, but she stood with a stillness that defied her situation. Her hair was a cascade of black silk, and her eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on some distant point beyond the leering faces. A man in military fatigues, smelling of sweat and cheap liquor, was shouting to the crowd. Found her near the railroad camps. Strong, young, and knows how to work. Sold by order of the territory. His voice was coarse, as if he were selling livestock. Owen's friends, drunk and boisterous, started shoving him. "Go on, Owen. Buy yourself some company," one of them bellowed, sparking a round of cruel laughter. The men saw her as a curiosity, a thing to be mocked and used. One tossed a pebble that bounced off her shoulder. She didn't flinch. The auctioneer began the bidding at a paltry $10. The offers were slow, punctuated by crude jokes. 15, shouted a grimy prospector. Owen's friend slapped him on the back. "What's the matter, Owen? A lonely man like you could use a helper." A mean-spirited idea, born of whiskey and resentment, took hold. He would make a joke of this whole spectacle, a joke so big it would shut them all up. Before he could think it through, Owen's voice cut through the noise, loud and clear. $100. The crowd fell silent, turning to stare at him. The auctioneer's eyes widened. Owen's friends gaped, their laughter dying in their throats. He hadn't meant to win. He'd just meant to make a point, to mock their pathetic bids with an absurd sum. But no one else spoke. The auctioneer, seizing the moment, slammed his gavel down. "Sold. To the rancher." The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. The crowd erupted, not in bidding, but in laughter directed at him. His joke had backfired spectacularly. The soldier shoved the woman toward him, handing him a crude bill of sale. "She's your problem now," he grunted. Owen, his face burning with shame and anger, paid the money and roughly untied her hands. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her gaze was not fearful or pleading, but steady and penetrating, as if she could see the hollow man behind the drunken bravado. The ride to his ranch was a long, tense silence. He had lifted her onto his horse and climbed up behind her, the whispers and stares of the townspeople following them like vultures. She sat perfectly straight, not leaning against him, her silence a heavy weight. When they finally reached his small, isolated cabin, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red. He helped her down and gestured curtly toward the one-room cabin. "You can stay here for the night," he muttered, his voice gravelly. Inside, she stood near the wall, her eyes taking in the sparse room, the rough bed, the iron stove, the worn table. Owen poured a cup of water and thrust it at her. She took it with a quiet grace that irritated him further. He heated up some leftover stew and slammed a bowl down on the table. She sat and ate with slow, deliberate movements. When she finished, she looked at him, her expression unreadable. He expected tears or pleas, but her voice, when it came, was low and clear, cutting through the thick air and his whiskey haze. "You have the eyes of a man who has lost his soul," she said, her English precise. "Did you think buying another would help you find it?" Owen froze. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow, bypassing his anger and piercing the old, festering wound of his grief. He had expected anything but this, an accusation that was also a profound truth. He stared at her, suddenly sober, seeing not a purchase or a problem, but a person with more dignity in her bound hands than he had in his entire life. He sank into a chair, the bravado draining out of him, leaving only shame. That was a mistake, he finally managed to say. A cruel joke. You're free. You can leave in the morning. She looked at him for a long moment. Freedom is not a thing to be bought and sold, she whispered, her words echoing his own hypocrisy. You have made me your responsibility. With that, she turned away, leaving him to grapple with the weight of what he had done. Owen slept fitfully in his chair. At dawn, he awoke to the sounds of movement. He stepped outside to see her by the well, pulling up a bucket of water with a strength that surprised him. She had already swept the cabin floor and was tending to his neglected chickens. She moved with a quiet purpose that shamed his own inaction. You don't have to do that, he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. She turned to him, her gaze calm. If I stay, I work. He couldn't argue. They worked through the morning in a strange, unspoken truce. He found himself watching her, amazed by her resilience. She seemed to understand the land and the animals, calming a nervous horse with a soft touch. The work didn't feel lonely anymore. Later, he brought her a simple dress that had belonged to his late wife, feeling a pang as he pulled it from an old chest. This might be better, he said, holding it out. She took the fabric, her fingers tracing the simple stitching. Your wife? She asked gently. He could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. That evening, she finally told him her name was Mai. As they sat by the fire, Owen found himself talking, telling her about his wife and son, the fever that took them, and the emptiness that followed. Mai listened, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. Then she shared her own story of soldiers burning her village, of losing her family, and of being captured while trying to flee. They said I was worth something, she finished, her voice flat. I learned it is better to be worth nothing than to have a price. A few days later, one of the men from town rode out to the ranch, a smirk on his face. Heard you're enjoying your new toy, Owen, he called out. Before the man could say more, Owen walked straight up to him, his face set like stone. Her name is Mai, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And she is worth more than this entire town. You're not welcome here again. The man, stunned by Owen's ferocity, quickly turned his horse and fled. When he turned back, Mai was standing on the porch, having heard everything. A small, uncertain light flickered in her eyes. That night, she presented him with a small, intricately carved bird made from a piece of scrap wood. For protection, she said simply. He took it, his rough fingers tracing its smooth lines. He knew then that the silence of his ranch had been filled, not just with her presence, but with a life he thought he had lost forever. One evening, he took the bill of sale from his pocket, the paper that declared her his property. He held it over the fire, watching as the flames consumed the ugly words until only ash remained. You were right, he said, turning to her. Freedom can't be bought. And I can't give you what you already own. But I'm asking you, Mai. I'm asking you to stay. Not as someone who works for me, but as someone who stands beside me. He took a deep breath. I'm asking you to be my wife. Tears welled in Mai's eyes, the first he had ever seen. You did not have to burn the paper, she whispered. You burned it in your heart the day you defended my name. They were married by a traveling preacher a week later, with the wide-open plains as their witness. Their life was not easy. The whispers in town never fully ceased, and the hardships of the land were ever present. But inside the small cabin, there was peace. Owen's bitterness had been replaced by a quiet devotion, and my sorrow had found a safe harbor. They had started as a cruel joke, two broken souls thrown together by fate. But in the shared silence of the lonely ranch, they had found something far more real, a home, built not of wood and stone, but of forgiveness, respect, and a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places.